Hi, Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane and Hurricane HD video blog for Monday, June the 18th, 2012. Let's check out what's going on out here. You're probably aware that we have 95L out in the subtropical Atlantic, way up here to the northeast of Bermuda, which is right there. And you can tell it's got a front still attached to it, so it looks like a big comma. Non-tropical in nature, but it is producing winds to near gale force out here, so a potent ocean storm, but nothing tropical. It doesn't have that warm core where the center is warmer than the outside of it. The winds are spread out over a much larger area, and it's got that front associated with it, so it's over somewhat warm waters, although not warm enough to support tropical development, as we'll see here on the sea surface temperatures map. Is sitting about right up here, and those waters there are 22 degrees Celsius, definitely not warm enough to support the deep tropical convection that you would need to warm the atmosphere around the system and to make it purely tropical. And speaking of the sea surface temperatures, this is the 26-degree line right here, Celsius. That's about 79 degrees or so Fahrenheit. And that extends from about the Cape Verde area of Africa all the way over across the Atlantic to just off the southeast coast. There's been a pretty persistent fetch of north to northeast winds over the east coast here the last few days, and that has helped to keep the sea surface temperatures rather cool compared to where they should be this time of year, only by a little bit though. And you can see the rest of the Atlantic basin, very warm sea surface temperatures as you'd expect. Nothing too much. Well, we'll look at the anomalies actually in just a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. A different perspective of the Atlantic basin. We see this fairly long area of just generally disturbed weather. There's 95L sitting up here. A little bit of convective activity on the northwest side, the northern side of it. And there's Bermuda right there. Finally, your weather with southwesterly winds coming across here, clearing out. We'll be watching this general region for the possibility of development, although I don't see much chance of that happening. Some of this energy associated with a tropical wave and all of that will try to dump in here to the Bay of Campeche, where there's at least a chance that something will try to develop. I don't see anything in the global computer models to indicate that it'll be very strong, so probably not much to worry about, but we'll certainly watch it because that's what we do. In the eastern Pacific, looks like we may see another development here off the coast of Mexico. The East Pacific season been very busy so far with Aleta, Bud, and most recently Carlotta. Now this system trying to develop slowly. Pretty large envelope of energy there, and it'll move gradually towards Mexico, bringing more heavy rain to the region, and that is something people are going to really need to watch there. So the active East Pacific season continues. Looking at sea surface temperature anomalies, and then I want to compare where we are now to where we were in 2009 when we had the last El Nino event. First, let's talk about the departures from normal for today. You can see that most of the tropical Atlantic is basically right at to just slightly above normal in some places. Other places, as indicated by the blue patches, just a little bit below normal. And here, as I mentioned, that below normal water off the southeast coast due to the fairly strong north to northeast winds that have been blowing across that region as of late, making the ocean a little bit colder than it should be. The Gulf of Mexico and the Western Caribbean running above normal. And then up here in the subtropics, we do have a band of above normal sea surface temperatures, but being only that it's just past mid-June, none of this really matters. We got about another 60 days until it'll really start to matter. In the Pacific, we see the warming indicating that the El Nino is trying to take shape, and that is the abnormal warming of the tropical Pacific due to a lessening of the trade winds through this region. And just like if you don't swim in your swimming pool, it'll start to stagnate and it warms up. That's a similar analogy anyway. You need those trade winds blowing strong across this area to keep the water stirred up, and what's basically like a conveyor belt going, where cold water off the coast of South America gets upwelled and pushed towards the west by those strong and persistent trade winds. When those weaken, you start to warm the tropical Pacific, and that's what's been happening. We've seen a change in the pressure pattern over the region, and we're starting to see a warm-up. Now, some people have said that this year is similar to 2009, the last El Nino we had. But let me show you what the anomalies were exactly 3 years ago, and I think you can see there's quite a difference. Look at how much of the entire Pacific was warm compared to normal back in 2009. And a good deal more of the tropical Atlantic here was below normal. And we had a fairly large area of above normal temperatures in the Atlantic well outside of the tropics. But let's just focus on the Pacific. If I go back to now, you see we do have the background of a very cold Pacific, what we call the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's just a period of time, basically, to simplify it, where the Pacific is colder than normal over a large scale for several years in a row, sometimes more than a decade, hence the decadal part of PDO. Then you have the warming tropical Pacific, but it's trying to compete with this overall colder signal of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the cold phase of it. And again, if I go to 2009, you see that the tropical Pacific all the way out, even off the map here, was well above normal. The rest of the Pacific was above normal. So that El Nino had a lot more influence than the one that we're heading into this year, I think. Therefore, the Atlantic Basin should have just about an average season since about 1995 to 2010, that average. You take all the storms that we've had during that time period, add them up, and divide by that number of years, and we should get anywhere from 12 to 13 total named storms this year. We've had 2 already, Alberto and Beryl, so I think we could see 11 more total, and we still have probably 6, 7, or 8 hurricanes to go, because we're not seeing a very, very warm, overwhelming signal here coming out of the Pacific that would send very strong trade winds, well, not really trade winds, but upper level winds is what I meant to say, into the Atlantic. And in fact, let me just give you a brief lesson on that. When you warm the tropical Pacific, you generate more convection over this area, more upward motion in the atmosphere, and then that wind cuts across the tropical Atlantic like this, and you cut off those tropical waves that move west into that wind, and you don't get that much development in the Atlantic. That's the general simplification of why El Nino is typically negative for the Atlantic. And that's what we had in 2009. This very, very warm tropical Pacific led to stronger wind shear cutting across the tropical Atlantic, more upper level lows developing all over the place. They impart southwesterly winds across the region, and it just creates a big mess for the Atlantic Basin to try to produce hurricanes. And I don't see that that will be too much of an inhibitor this year, maybe just a little bit. But it's those years where we seem to have 12, 13, 14 named storms that we tend to get some pretty significant strikes on land. Not always the case, but it seems to be, going back through history, that more often than not is the case. So there you have it. You're up to date now for Monday, the 18th of June. I'll be back here tomorrow with another update. Again, I'm Mark Sudduth. HurricaneTrack.com is my website. Always glad to contribute these video blogs to Hurricane and Hurricane HD, and I'll be back again tomorrow.